Well, hey, what's up? Pastor Matt here. Wanted to talk to you today about one of the great literary works in American history, and that would be Herman Melville's classic book, which I just completed the other day. Finally, Moby Dick. This is one of those books that everybody should probably read at some point in their lifetime. There are certain works of fiction, prose, history, theology, etc., that everybody should read in order to be conversant with literature in general and general knowledge overall. And Herman Melville's Moby Dick is probably one of those books that most people should probably read at some point in their life. And I have to admit that I was rather loath to begin that process because what I'd heard about Moby Dick is that it is extremely long, it is extremely boring, and it is extremely digressive. And what I mean by the word digressive is to say that while the plot is extraordinarily strong, there's a great action-adventure story here that takes place between Captain Ahab and his hatred for the great whale Moby Dick. Nevertheless, there are a number of chapters where the plot line completely disappears like a rope sinking down into the water, and you're wondering, where in the world is this going? Melville writes with a number of different genres throughout the book. First of all, it is a fictional tale, although it does have some historicity to it, in that Moby Dick was loosely based off an adventure that one ship had with a whale, a particularly misadventurous event in which the ship was destroyed and most of the crew either died or almost did. I think some people survived. Anyway, there is a historical thread there that connects to the story, but it is nevertheless fictional in the sense that all the characters that Melville creates are entirely non-historical. But aside from that, you have entire chapters where Melville talks about the science of the biological facts of whales and whaling and the oil that is exhumed from the sperm whale's head. You have entire chapters about the sea. You have entire sections about a ship and its rigging and its moorings and its anchors and its lines and its decks and its poop decks and quarter decks. I mean, Melville goes into quite a bit of detail on all these things. And what happens to a lot of readers when they try to begin to read Moby Dick is that the digressions in the book simply overwhelm them like waves, and they find themselves without an oar to continue to paddle. And so many people quit reading Moby Dick and they don't get to the great conclusion of the story. And the story is fantastic. The book itself contains a number of different literary genres. Okay, so there's fiction, there's some science, there is poetry, there is sermonic material. There's at least one full sermon in the book. Aside from that, you also have some chapters that read like a stage play with directions of this character onto the scene, this character exits stage left, etc. And I think all of that is intentional for Melville to display his vast literary powers and that he can write in almost every single genre imaginable. And he does it all, and many readers unfortunately fall out of the ship by the time they get to the end of the story. Well, let me give you really quick an overview of the plot of Moby Dick, and then you can decide whether or not it's worth reading 600 pages of the same. Ishmael is the narrator of the story. He opens with the famous line in the very beginning of the book, "Call me Ishmael." And of course you remember that Ishmael is a biblical character who was rejected from the Abrahamic line, and yet nevertheless he survives. His mother is Hagar, and he has a history of his own, somewhat of a nefarious history in the scriptures. But Ishmael is the one character who likewise survives to tell the story of the Pequod's encounter, that's the name of the boat, the Pequod's encounter with the great whale Moby Dick, who is himself one of the lead characters of the story. And what Moby Dick symbolizes is one of the great questions of the book. So if you're interested in the symbolism there, one of the questions you should ask yourself as you're reading is, what in the world does Moby Dick symbolize? I have a theory on that. I'll get back to it in just a moment. Then, of course, the lead character is the Captain Ahab, who also is named after a biblical character. Ahab, one of the worst, most wicked kings in Israel's history, is an idolatrous king. And Captain Ahab's great idolatry is his hatred for the whale Moby Dick. And as you read the story, you realize that Ahab is absolutely bent on the conquest, destruction, and murder of Moby Dick. He is so bent on the destruction of this great whale, this white whale, that he's willing to risk only his own life, not only the lives of all of his crew, but even there are times where he could help another boat. Several times, opportunities for him to do something good, and yet no, he is bent on the destruction, the harpooning, and the harvesting of Moby Dick, who he wants to kill. Why does Ahab want to kill Moby Dick so badly? Well, because they've had a previous encounter, you see. Some of the great themes of literature are man against man against himself, and man against nature. And so Moby Dick takes on those latter two categories. Man against nature, can the human Captain Ahab destroy the indestructible whale? And also Ahab's inner conflict with himself. There are times where he knows that his conquest is bent on destruction and error and evil, and yet he cannot seem to turn away from his desire to destroy the whale itself. Now, spoiler alerts are coming. Spoiler alerts. Stop the video right now if you don't want to know what happens. But there are a number of symbols and foreshadowings throughout the book in which the destruction of the Pequod, the ship that Captain Ahab leads, is certain. And in fact, it's exactly what happens. When we get to the last 3 chapters of the book, day 1, day 2, and day 3, they're called, Captain Ahab and Ishmael and all the other great characters, Starbuck, the first mate, all of these characters go into a 3-day battle with the whale. Now this is where the action gets really heavy. So if you bailed out, if you quit during some of the more scientific analyses of whales and their oil and whatnot, tune in again for the last 3 chapters, because they have a 3-day battle with the whale. And in all 3 days, Moby Dick, the great whale, beats down Captain Ahab and his sailors and his crew and his ship and his boats. And at the end of the book, we see the colossal failure of Ahab's idolatry as his ship and the boats are sunk down into the ocean by the great whale. Captain Ahab himself is torn out of his boat by the line on which his harpoon is affixed to Moby Dick, and he is drowned. And so Captain Ahab loses the great conquest and battle with the whale. So what does the whale symbolize? Well, some people would suggest that the whale symbolizes nature, that nature is a force that man cannot understand, much less conquer. But others, including R.C. Sproul, who wrote one of his earliest writings on the book Moby Dick, theorize that the whale actually symbolizes God himself. That's right, the whale is white. Whales aren't usually white, but white stands, as Melville himself describes a whole chapter of the whiteness of the whale, for purity, but also for supernaturalism, for terror, and for invincibility. And so Moby Dick is, in some people's view, a symbol of the unconquerable God. And Ahab's hatred for Moby Dick stands for mankind's rebellion against God's omnipotent power. Okay, so there's an overview of the book with all of its digressions. You can get through it. You should get through it. Everybody should probably read this book at least once. Let me now make a recommendation of what copy and edition that you can get that will be very readable for you. And here it is. I'm going to kind of turn now. Hopefully you can get a view of this. This is Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and I bought this at the Barnes & Noble store in my area. And one of the reasons I bought this particular edition is because, first of all, it's hardback. It's a beautiful leather-covered edition. It's got the gilded page edges. It's got a beautiful blue ribbon to it. And more than that, when you actually look at the pagination, the layout is just very, very clear, readable. The paper is high-quality paper, not that gross stuff that kind of disintegrates and turns yellow over time, but high-quality paper. And for me, the reading experience of a book is just as important as getting through the book itself. And sometimes, in fact, having a good, beautiful copy of a book helps you to stay in it, to win it, so to speak, to actually finish the book. And so I wanted one that felt great in the hand. I wanted one that read really clearly, nice, clear font. And for me, that's just a helpful thing. If I'm going to spend 20, 30, 40 hours reading a 700-page book, however long it takes to read a book like that, I'm going to want a very quality edition in my hand that I can keep in my library forever. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to post the link to this particular copy of Moby Dick in the description of this video, and you can hop online and go ahead and grab one for yourself. I do recommend. I have seen a number of other editions of Moby Dick. None of them are as superior in printing and physical form as this particular one that I'm going to link below. Okay, well, thanks for checking in today. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Matt_Everhard, my last name. Also, my sermons and preaching are on another YouTube page. That'd be Faith Evangelical Presbyterian Church. I am a Presbyterian minister. Preach the gospel. If you're interested in that, go like, follow, subscribe on that page. And if you want to do the same, here on my personal page, I talk about books, I talk about Bibles, and I talk about theology from time to time. So I'd love for you to subscribe and like this video. Have a great day. Love you lots. Talk to you soon.